afternoon, everybody. Glad to have you here. Some of you are just now turning on your audio. Glad you're here with us this second Tuesday. Lovely to see you. I can't wait for you to all meet each other in person one of these days, because you would be completely. How does Katie know? How does loving what is her name? Byron Katie says, if you saw how wonderful you are, you'd fall down in admiration at your own feet. That kind of thing. So that's a little bit much for some of us Christians, but yeah, I love it. So what a beautiful gathering. We're glad you're here. We are thrilled to invite a guest whose work we've been following for a while, whose the implications of whose work has great influence and impact on the work we're doing in Genesis 2 and in our church planting work these days. So we are thrilled to have you. This will be a recorded session for those who cannot make it. And if you're watching this later on, we hope that you feel free to send us questions and feedback, because I can promise you this will not be the only time that we visit with our guest whom we've invited to reflect on our own ministry. So in a second, I'm going to turn the reins over to Steve, but if you would just go over to the chat and put your name and where that place from which you're joining us, that would be great. If you want to include the name of your ministry, that's fine, but generally just where you are geographically as you join us.
Tuesdays through the Episcopal.
Hey, Shelley Carlson.
Yes.
Hi, we could hear you there. Sweet. All right, so feel free to put your name and location in the chat. And as you do, we're welcoming the rest of us. And Steve, if you want to make me co-host, I'll tend to the people joining from here forward. I'm joining you from Western North Carolina, where I spend most of the time when I'm not traveling. And I'm thrilled to be co-hosting this with Steve Matthews. We were just saying to Jennifer a moment ago, Steve and I have been doing this for 12 years together. So there's some celebration about to happen. And if you've not yet registered for our LA gathering called Genesis Gathering coming up in a week, it's not too late to let us know you plan on being there. And just send us a text. All right. Glad you're here with us. We welcome you. Later on, after Jennifer finishes sharing, we'll invite you to connect with us via questions via chat, or if you'd like, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to unmute as well. So we'll have an initial session of sharing, and then we'll open it up for your questions and interactions thereafter. Again, glad you're here. Steve Matthews, over to you.
Thanks, Tom. It's so nice to see faces we know and faces we don't know. So welcome from Maine to California, and everywhere in between. One of the things that Jennifer will probably talk a little bit about today is quality of life. And just as a quick check-in, we're going to do this in the chat as well. I want to invite you to think about the community where you reside, or the neighborhood. If you're in a big city, it might just be the neighborhood, but the community where you reside. And what would you say is one of the biggest factors to quality of life in that neighborhood? Is it connection to neighbors? Is it resources? Is it walkability? What is it that you say contributes greatly to the quality of life in the community where you reside? Just throw that in the chat. Just one. And I'll put the question in there. Will somebody be willing to read these while I'm typing? Just a few of them.
I can read them, Steve.
Oh, thanks.
Clean air and water, access to nature, big sky, quality of education, commuting time, conscientious neighbors, What you drive and where, sad face. Being close to the ocean, small enough to make a difference. Nature and open spaces. We're at the heart of our small city, right on the central city park. Love. Connecting with neighbors via Facebook groups where we give things away to each other, offer reviews, and connect. Economic status. It's a walkable and small neighborhood in a city of 800,000. Walkability in parks. A small CBD that is easy walk distances from most of our 912 citizens. We run into each other at the post office, grocery, bar, coffee shop. Lots of public spaces to gather. Proximity to nature and increasing diversity. Bike paths and parks.
Thank you, Bill. That's great. You all keep adding. And in the meantime, I want to invite Meg. Meg is the canon to the ordinary in the Diocese of Iowa, and she introduced us to Jennifer and the work that they've been doing together in the Diocese of Iowa.
Thanks, Steve. I'm so pleased to have Jennifer with us. I think it was 2018 or 2019 when our diocese learned that Iowa State University was working on a research project called Rural Shrink Smart that was studying small Iowa towns that were losing population, but managing to maintain or even increase their quality of life despite that. We began communicating with one of the project leaders and had planned to have them as the main part of a small church summit in 2020, and then the world shut down. But we saw important connections in their work, as I think you will too, for our rural and shrinking churches who are seeking new ways of maintaining or increasing their vitality, and in the work that ISU has been doing to help communities face the reality that comes with population loss and work together to address their quality of life and seek the welfare of their town. They shared some of their findings with our churches here in Iowa this summer, and we are really looking forward to engaging with the curriculum they're developing to assist small towns' efforts to thrive amidst the realities of population loss. So our guest today is Jennifer Drinkwater, one of the members of the Rural Shrink Smart team. That team includes community and regional planning experts and statisticians and architects and industrial designers and sociologists and artists like Jennifer. Jennifer's field is art and visual culture, and she's the community art specialist at Iowa State University. And she loves to explore how bringing artwork out into the world and making together art together in community can build and shape community. So Jennifer, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Meg. How is everyone today? It's really great to be here. I also need to mention that I'm a lifelong Episcopalian, so I was sort of thrilled to be around my crew. I grew up in Jackson, Mississippi, and went to St. Andrew's Cathedral and St. Andrew's School, so feels very familiar. But I'm going to the best of my ability, kind of summarize some of the highlights of some of the work we've been doing in about 20 minutes so that we have time to talk about it. So I'll talk a little bit about the history of the project, our findings, and how it might apply to you in the varied ways that you engage with the world in a variety of different community sizes and spaces. So get out something to write down questions, because if I go too fast, I'm sure things will pop up. I'm going to share my screen because I have a few slides. So bear with me just a second. And I assume that everybody can see this PowerPoint. Yes, great. Okay, so we're going to start with the slideshow. So Meg mentioned the project is called Rural Shrink Smart. And the history of that starts with a colleague and friend of mine, Kimberly Zeracor, who is an architectural historian. She has done a lot of work in Eastern Europe in kind of urban spaces and was very knowledgeable about smaller cities in Eastern Europe shrinking in population, but maintaining quality of life. And so she started collaborating in 2017 with a rural sociologist here on campus named Dave Peters, and they decided to apply that framework to rural communities in Iowa. Now, we have been for the past 4 years working with these 6 communities that you see on the screen. They're all pretty small. The largest is Sac City with a population of 2,000. All of these communities have, even with the most recent census, have lost population. And all of them are maintaining or increasing quality of life, which is a unicorn sort of scenario that you don't hear a lot about. So we wanted to learn how they're doing that with the hope that we could then translate that into curriculum and resources for other communities to do the same. So a lot of the information comes from something that Iowa State has been working on for decades called the Small Towns Project. This is a survey project that's come out of the sociology department, and it started in the mid-90s. And the sociology department will send out surveys to every county in Iowa, 99 counties. So they will pick one town, one small town, which is under 10,000. And they send out a survey every 10 years trying to assess what creates quality of life in these communities. And so 30 years of finding some of the really interesting things, especially having grown up in Mississippi, where all we heard about was we need more jobs and people need more money. So it was always income and infrastructure. And what they found over the 30 years of research from small town surveys is that the communities that have the highest self-reported quality of life also have the highest self-reported local civic engagement and the highest reported levels of social capital or belonging. And those findings are more sort of, they rank higher than even income level. And so that, for me as an artist with not a huge community development background, that sort of burst the bubble of everything I thought I had heard, you know, in the news and in the media about what makes quality of life. And so those findings is what led us to figure out which of the 6 communities to target and talk to, those that, again, have the shrinking populations, but the increasing quality of life over the 30 years. And since then, I got on the project in 2019, and then the pandemic hit. So we did a lot of things virtually, but my role as the artist on this, the lone artist on this team of like ragtag researchers, was to lead 2 studio classes with students at Iowa State. In 2 of these, we ended up being in 3 of the small towns, and we used art as a way of creating belonging or increasing social capital in those communities, which was super fun. Spending a lot of time with these communities, we really wanted to know like what exactly they were doing, right? Like how were they getting volunteers to come to events? How were they making people excited about living there? How are they creating momentum and increasing this quality of life? And what we have found is over the past 5 years, we're slowly turning into curriculum. And this is sort of the framework, right? It's very broad. And the reason is that we hope that people can apply it however they can apply it in the different idiosyncrasies of their own community. So it starts with acknowledging the good, working on belonging through bridging, and landing on the how matters. And I'm going to talk about each of these pretty briefly with a special focus on belonging through bridging. So acknowledging the good really just means that you're using a lens of asset-based community development. We're really trying to shift our mindset from kind of looking at problem, and trying to look at the framework with the asset mindset, because we know that when we focus on, and the research has proven this, when we focus on what exists in communities, what we have, and we try and leverage those and make things better, that's more effective than getting together and complaining about what is missing. So that's sort of trying to prompt people into having that different mindset. And then we focus on belonging through bridging. And what we found in all of these communities is that belonging is essential, right? And so we ask folks what that means. They tell us that it means feeling connected. And the way that they demonstrate that is over these tiny moments, face to face, over a long period of time. It's these small investments in relationships. And it can be obviously in person and also via Zoom, right? Where we can see our facial expressions and have that connected humanity. One of the things that I will tell students or other audiences that I talk to about this topic is that belonging is crucial, right? We know that sort of intuitively, we know that on a human level, but the research supports that if in high levels of quality of life in communities, we have high levels of social capital. I'm going to talk in just a second about what the two different types of social capital, but social capital is essentially a fancy word for belonging. And we know that for folks to invest time and energy into relationships and to a place, they need to feel like they belong, because then they feel like they have agency and they can participate actively. So one of the things I try and drive home to more academic audiences, I don't feel like I'll probably have to do that with y'all, but I ask people to take a minute and close their eyes and imagine spending time with someone that you feel really cares about you. Who is someone that you feel like you can totally be yourself around? Someone who knows your history, who's excited to see you, who sort of lights up when you enter the room. And feel how you, like, imagine how you feel around that person, and then imagine how your behavior changes. How do you act? I invite people to consider they probably act more like themselves. They probably have more confidence. They probably feel relaxed and feel like they can be totally authentic. And then the opposite side of that is imagine spending time with someone who you don't think likes you very much, who maybe interrupts you a lot, they dismiss you, they roll your eyes at you, they do, whatever behavior kind of communicates that to you. And how do you feel around that person? And then how do you behave? And for me, I tend to be pretty chatty and extroverted, but when I'm around people I don't think likes me, I shut down. I don't engage, I don't participate. I try and get out as quickly as possible. And I would argue that places can make us feel the same way, right? Places and spaces can make us feel supported and engaged and like we belong there, or like we don't. And so the key is to sort of think about how we are creating and participating in that feeling of belonging. So I'm going to switch gears and put the academic hat on for just a second and give you a different way to think about it. Steve sort of shared with me that this is a kind of a crucial element to what you guys are all engaging with in your own communities. And then this gives you just some fancy language for that. So, but there's two different types of social capital. Remember, social capital is sort of a fancy word for belonging, strength of networks. Two types. There's bonding, which is grounded in connection of people who have very similar backgrounds and histories and experiences. It's grounded in identity. And so it's the sort of sense of who we are. This is who we are. This is how we are. This is how we behave. And it's pretty common, and it's more common and stronger in small communities and in small organizations, particularly in rural communities. So you have people who have very similar demographics, very similar background experiences. And while that can be really great for having that sense of sort of feeling connected, right? It provides that connection. Too much is bad, because then you can have an insider-outsider relationship. And like growing up in Mississippi, I'm a sixth generation Mississippian, and there are people that I'm in my mid 40s, people who have lived in Mississippi since like the 60s and 70s, who've moved in from Alabama, who are still considered like Yankee outsiders, right? It can just be that sort of real sense of us versus them. The other side of that is bridging. Bridging social capital is connecting individuals who have diverse backgrounds, diverse experiences. They may have one or 2 points in common, but broadly, they have not shared that same like background, childhood history. They're grounded in purpose. They're grounded in connecting, bridging each other to move forward in collective action or a goal. There's no ceiling for bridging. Bridging, the more is always better. We have not seen any research on bridging. Too much bridging is bad. Like, and actually in sociology, the phrase that sociologists use was communities that have high bonding get along, and communities that have high bridging get ahead. Like the way to move forward with sort of collective action to make change is to bridge. So how do we bridge? There's research that suggests that bridging social capital can be built through regular face-to-face fun interaction, right? That's it. You just need to spend time with people in person or on Zoom on a regular basis and have a positive experience. And you can do that in a variety of ways. So once we start to create that bridging social capital, that can start to lead to collective action. And that can be key in improving communities and improving quality of life. But if you can have money, you can have infrastructure, you can have all of these things, all of these ingredients that we hear about for quality of life. But if you don't have a sense of network belonging, none of those things really move forward. So again, our responsibility, right, how we can engage in this sort of work is the tiny moments of belonging. And so what we encourage people to consider is how we do that, right? Because we can have the best of intentions, but if we move quickly toward the end goal of whatever we think the collective action of the project needs to be, and we gloss over how we're going about doing that, it can actually be damaging, and it does not lead to belonging. So here are some best practices that I bring to people to sort of think about the how matters, like how you are creating belonging. So STP is just a hilarious acronym that I learned doing extension work called Your Same 10 People. So we sort of start to lean on our same core group of volunteers, our same core group of supporters, the people that we know can get things done. Everybody on this call is probably someone's STP, right? You are the people who show up, who are really part of your community. The problem with that is that we get so comfortable, we don't expand our networks. We're not actively inviting other people to participate. So we want to think about expanding our STP. We want to do with, not for. I think, again, a lot of times we have good intentions. We want to do things for others on behalf of others. But again, it's a mindset shift of just sort of stepping back and trying to invite other people into a process, invite other people into a space. And with that becomes, we're often challenged, I know as an artist, whenever I do collaborative art projects, there becomes sort of a relinquishing of aesthetic control when I'm doing something with someone else. And so I have to step back and sort of allow the process to unfold as it will, knowing that that final outcome is probably not going to be what I assumed it would be. And that's good. Again, the process, that building of relationship, that investment in relationship is more important than whatever final outcome toward quality of life that we can make. I always invite people to think about barriers or participation. If people aren't participating, if people aren't showing up to things, to meetings, to calls of action, what possibilities may there be that they may not do that? Is it meeting time? Is it lack of childcare, lack of transportation? Again, these small minutiae, right? We think about these things. These are the how matters. This is like how we translate that sort of good intention into fostering belonging. I always encourage people to personally invite, right? Don't just send out a mass email. Don't put a Facebook post up. I have done that. I have tried to orchestrate events and had 0 people show up because I have not done this right. I always tell folks that a lot of these things, you can either be a good role model or a horrible warning. And I tend to be the horrible warning. So a lot of these come from my sort of like, don't do this, because I have done it. Reducing red tape. This is probably more specific to like real civic projects, but if you have a call for something and you want to invite people into a process, a grant process, make sure that the qualifications for that are easy and streamlined, right? The more hoops that people have to jump through to participate in something, the fewer people you're going to get to participate. And finally, show up, right? I know that with extension and doing the community work I've done, I have hosted things and been disgruntled when people haven't been there, but then I have to remind myself, am I getting out of my studio enough? Am I getting out of my house enough? Am I participating and going into enough things? So I'm gonna show you two quick examples of how communities have begun to bridge, and then end with a few resources that are more art related, and then we will be done and open up for questions. So I'm flying by for this conversation. Okay, so Elma, Iowa is one of our communities that we worked with. Elma has about 500 people. It's an itty bitty town in Northeast Iowa. So Elma is surrounded, the community that surrounds Elma, there are 2,000 Mennonites. So you have a large Mennonite population. and a predominantly white non-Mennonite population. And so Elma was in desperate need of a medical clinic. They did not have one. Their closest medical clinic was 40 miles away. That was problematic for the community, and particularly the Mennonite community, because they literally travel horse and buggy 40 miles to go to the doctor. And so Elma reached out to the regional health services of Howard County to try and pitch them building a medical clinic in their community. Well, it often isn't in the best interest of a town or of a health clinic to have a clinic in such a small community because of the population. And so the Mennonites were worked together with the folks in Elma and actually went in and approached this health services and basically said that they would they worked out a deal where the Mennonites would provide lumber and labor to help build this clinic. And they said that they would basically attend exclusively this medical clinic as long as they could pay in cash and not have to go through health insurance. So there was this sort of like, again, we talk about decreasing red tape, right? And making things easier for people to participate. And this medical clinic was built in 2020 and is thriving in this little tiny town where you hear all over the nation about rural hospitals closing, health clinics closing. The way that this happened is because the Mennonite population and the people in Elma had been building these slow relationships over 20 years. People in Elma shop at the lumber yards that the Mennonites own. They go to their greenhouses, they go to their farmers markets, and there had been a sense of trust that had built slowly over time without the goal of some big collective action, but because they had built those relationships, that foundation was in place. When they needed to come together, they were able to, and they were able to really work out solutions that benefited both populations, which was amazing. And in fact, when this medical clinic was built, one of the guys on the fire department is a Mennonite, and he went to the city clerk and said, "Hey, can we build a hitching post for our horses outside the medical clinic?" And they were like, "Yeah, sure, that sounds great. No problem." So there's a hitching post for the Mennonite population outside of this medical clinic in Elma, Iowa, which I think is an amazing story. I'm going to shift gears to rural Minnesota and talk a little bit about how theater can aid in bridging, right? Bridging populations. And this is an awesome theater company called Place-Based Productions. It is the brainchild of a woman named Ashley Hansen and a man named Andrew Gaylord. They were theater makers. They were both from Minnesota. They graduated from college. They wanted to use theater as a way to improve rural Minnesota because that's where they had both grown up. So they formed this company. They spend their time traveling around to small communities. They will spend 6 to 9 months in any given community, kind of on monthly visits. They'll go, they'll show up at churches, they'll show up at potlucks, they'll show up at the bar, and they just visit with people and they hear the stories of the community. And after a period of 6 to 9 months, they gather with the community and they write a script based on the community stories. Like what is the story of this place? How can we help you tell it? They hold auditions and everyone in the community comes out and tries out. No one's turned away. If you want to play guitar and you don't know how to play guitar, we got a spot for you playing guitar in this play. And they host a 1 weekend only production about a community. And they don't typically hold them in theaters because, to be honest, a lot of these communities don't even have theaters. They'll hold them on a bike trail or a walking theater production downtown or an underutilized park. Or once was they did paddling theater along the Minnesota River. So they had 8 acts all along different riverbanks. So people would kayak and canoe and they would stop and watch an act of a play, and they would go half a mile and watch another act. They really get creative with thinking about how they can showcase these places. And one of their most recent productions in the last 10 years was in a town called Milan, Minnesota. Now, Milan, Minnesota has about 360 people. The history of the community, it's Norwegian. It was founded in the late 19th century, a Norwegian like craft village. And so they have a lot of very strong Norwegian heritage. They have a little tiny art museum. They have a little village art school, but it's an aging, predominantly white population until about 10 years ago. And all of a sudden, half of their population within a 10-year period was young and Micronesian. And actually, the reason is because there was one resident from Milan who had gone into the Peace Corps in the 70s and had such a good experience. He was in Micronesia. he developed a really strong friendship, came back, kept in touch with this guy. And in early 2000s, this man came to visit to Minnesota and had such a good experience, he decided to move there. And slowly but surely, family members and extended relatives have moved to my land, Minnesota, and now half the population is Micronesian. Well, so now you have two parallel communities, right? You have an older white population and you have a younger Micronesian population, totally different languages, different cultures. Both have a really strong connection to water, ironically, being in the middle of Minnesota, in terms of Norway and Micronesia. But they have really embraced this community as best they can. And so this play was a really good attempt of having the community come together and learn about the different cultures. And so if anyone's participated in a theater production, you know that as a cast member, you spend a lot of time together, hours and hours and hours over weeks. And so that bridging happened between the Anglo population and the Micronesian population. And it provided an example of shared understanding and shared sort of cultural celebration. And it was just a sort of a symbol of trying to move the community forward past stereotypes and generalizations. And if you go on the MyLand Minnesota website, you can look at their 2020 community plan for the next 20 years. And they really kind of give some voice to moving forward in a progressive, inclusive way, which I think is great. And again, as an artist, what excites me, what has always excited me about the possibility of art, and now projects like this give language to that, is how art can serve as a vehicle to bring people together, right? How can we use theater, music, some types of visual art that aren't alienating and overly pretentious? And I'm a painter, so I say that with like tongue in cheek. How can we use those things to bring people together, to create bridges, right? Those face-to-face regular interactions that build that goodwill, that build that trust, that aren't like getting together for focus groups or getting together for a really hard city council meeting or something like that. So these are the questions that we typically ask people who come through our workshops. I'm not going to necessarily ask you of them, but I just wanted to share them. We ask people to identify where do you feel belonging in your community, and why do you feel belonging? Like those tiny moments, what makes you feel belonging? Is it because people smile at you? Do they greet you? Do they look up when you enter a room? Do they chat with you? Like, what are the specifics that make that happen or make that feeling happen? Then we ask folks to consider, how do they participate and create that experience of belonging? How are you engaging with that? What do you bring to the table? How are you actively contributing to that in your community? We ask people to identify where bridging may be happening. Like, where can you look in your community and see examples of bridging in your life or in your community? And then where do possibilities for bridging exist, right? A lot of times, if we want to engage in collective action, you can't just identify a group of people or an organization and be like, let's work together, if there's no trust there. And so it's these small moments of interaction that contribute to that trust, that foundation of trust, that then can lead to big changes happening down the road. And then how can you participate in these possibilities? Finally, I want to share some resources with you. Like I said, you can be a good role model or a horrible warning. When I first started working in Extension, the way I got my feet wet was I jumped into leading a bunch of community art projects, and I made a lot of mistakes. And I decided to create toolkits for people to use so they wouldn't make the same mistakes. And so these are all available for free. They're just downloadable PDFs that you can find at the Extension store at Iowa State. You can find them at my personal website, which is whatsgoodproject.com/toolkits. Again, they are free. So if you're like, oh, I've always wanted to learn more about what a yarn bomb is and how I might use that in my community, these have you covered. And I use it, I mean, I really try, the purpose of these is to bridge community through the process. I don't spell that out at the beginning because I don't want to scare people off, but that really is the goal, is to use the art to bring people together, to develop those relationships, to strengthen communities. If you live in a rural place and you want to learn more about the Shrink Smart project, you can check out our ruralshrinksmart.org. And if you are interested in sort of creative placemaking and how that can be used in a rural place, ruralplacemaking.com is a really awesome resource. My colleagues at the University of Kentucky, they're sort of the OG of community art extension, and they got a big USDA grant and have a ton of resources and examples and all kinds of stuff. So I would encourage you to check that out. And if you want to chat, you can contact me too. I love brainstorming with people. I love hearing what people are up to. I learn from people. Like, that is how I do this work, is hearing stories from what is working and what is not working. So I would love for you to share with me any experiences that you have that may be relevant, or if you have comments or questions, or, you know, again, how I can improve. I would love to hear that too. And that's all I have presentation wise. So I will stop
That's
sharing.
beautiful. Jennifer, thank you. You've provoked so much in my own imagination and from what I'm seeing in the chat conversations for all of us. So I just put a note in the chat as a way of being present to what you've just offered. Here's my suggestion. Before we open up for your questions, please tell us one idea or realization that you just heard from Jennifer, one that you want to make sure not to forget. So we invite you to just go ahead, put that in the chat. And once we've given ourselves a couple of minutes for that, we're acknowledging what we've already received before we ask for more, Jennifer, more resources, more inspiration. We're going to pause here. This was lovely. And I'm just going to read gently. Bridging through art, brilliant. I love that. Bridging versus bonding. Quality of life. Oh, this is coming in now. Quality of life is measured through connections. Yarn bomb. I love it. Who's the next person outside my 10 people? The limitless potential of bridging social capital. I love that too. What'sgoodproject.com. Difference between high bonding and high bridging. That's yay. Many short face-to-face connections is what builds the bonding and bridging. Yeah, on that note, Janae, feels like this is an excuse for having fun with people and really getting back to the joy of doing this work we've committed ourselves to doing. Too much bonding can lead to communities and churches that get along, but high bridging can help them get ahead. Regular interaction leads to bridging. Bridging, you can never have too much bridging, especially to expand STP, same 10 people. Rethink barriers to participation. Bridging is always good. Being childlike builds life. Ay, there, that's beautiful. I love that. Anyone else? All right, so let's think about this in terms of how you might share this with your beloved peeps back home, pro-to-pro conversations. What would you need to convey this, aside from a link to the recording for this session? Thinking about the context that you're in, what do you need to know? What's one more piece you might ask for to facilitate in you a commitment to sharing this back home? That's the question. So please let your questions be along those lines in this first round. You're a practitioner. You're obviously talking with somebody who's put a lot of heart and soul into this. So one of mine is early on, just to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. There was something lovely about when you said, as an artist, I've learned that relinquishing aesthetic control for the sake of upping the quality of our collective life. You know, I would love to know, Jennifer, what are the personal practices for you as an artist, but also as a leader, one who's hopeful about the quality of life? What are the personal practices that allow you to relinquish artistic control in community as you do this work? And then we have several more coming in, but what if we start there?
That's a great question. And I will go back to the yarn bomb example. So several years ago, I live in Ames, Iowa. We had a satellite studio facility for our college in downtown Ames. And part of that was a community art gallery. And I found myself somehow being the gallery manager for a period of time. And I thought it would be a great idea to have a large community art project to bridge campus with Ames. And I tried to think of what would be material or a process that people would not be intimidated by, that was not a mural, because a lot of times you think mural, people love them, people don't want to paint. So people knit and crochet, right? And a lot of people who knit and crochet don't consider themselves to be artists. And I always think about art as a way to engage people who don't identify as artists, because I think that's bridging. So I landed on knitting and crocheting, and I do not knit or crochet still at all. So I was forced to hire friends who were fiber artists to help me co-lead this project. And so I happily gave them all of the control of this project and knew that I could not be the head honcho, right? I had to sort of like bring in the experts and then step back. And it was amazing. And for whatever reason, I think I trusted the process. And I'm not normally someone who does that easily, but I had to do that because I had no knowledge. And so for me, it's getting into spaces and situations where I don't have the knowledge and I have to lean on others who have that knowledge. And that's what helps. Again, it provides like informal leadership opportunities for people, and it helps to kind of create that network of trust. If I go in knowing all the answers, then it's really hard to relinquish that control.
Beautiful, Jennifer. That speaks so much to the internal practices, the habits of the heart. That's good. Meg, you have to unmute and ask your question because it's on the tip of all of our tongues, right?
Yeah. Are there some practical things that you have discovered that might help us equip our congregations to be an agent of fostering more bridging, right? Like, what does it take to get a community that's so tightly knit into each other equipped to go be bridgers?
I mean, that's a great question, right? We have the same issue in academia, to be honest, like on campus, right? And so extension serves a really great network. I mean, honestly, I think you can start small, right? I think you can really spend time in your surrounding neighborhood. What surrounds your building? You know, who lives near there? Who works near there? How well do you know that neighborhood? And I think engaging in that sort of little tiny level and really trying to dive into getting to know that place deeply, or even more deeply if you already feel like you deeply know it, without sort of an end goal in mind, is probably a good first step. It doesn't feel scary. If you don't have, like, not having a project, and having a project in mind can feel scary, but just sort of exploring and meeting people just for the joy of it, I think maybe
And letting go of
easier
any thought
for
of we need to have
folks.
them in our pews, right?
Right. Yeah. Does that help?
And
okay.
Kirsten Swanson, I loved your response. Do you mind speaking out loud what you've put there in the chat? I know you put it there, response to the invitation, but please feel free to unmute.
Sure. I wrote, I am thinking about the first of the 3 steps, acknowledge the good. So much bonding can be based on shared complaining. What are some first steps in changing the culture of bonding through complaining?
Oh man. Yeah, it's really hard. I mean, I'm a hardcore complainer, you know? I mean, that is me. I'm a let's like anticipate all the terrible problems that can occur so then we can get ahead of them. Worst case scenario thinker. So I mean, it's almost like when I learned about asset-based community development through working in extension, it was almost like the macro of gratitude, right? We hear all about gratitude and sort of that micro gratitude about how important it is. But really, community development proves that it matters because it shows that when we get together and we take inventory of what is going right where we are, either in our lives or in our community spaces, and we actively seek to strengthen that, like it like creates this upward spiral. And so I think it's all about practice and habits, right? And like, how can you change a habit when you gather in a group? Like, what are some first questions that you can sort of almost like ritualize it in some way? Like sometimes when I have my wits about me, when I enter a class of students, I will ask them to share, like, what are 2 things that went right for you this week? And what's one challenge? Because the challenge gives them space to get that complaint out, but it frames it in a challenge rather than just a complaint. But I always try and like outweigh those good things. You know, it's really hard. I do not have a great answer for it, but I really can appreciate that question because it's a constant for me too, which is why I have a project called the What's Good Project as a constant reminder to look for it because it's hard.
Thank you, Jennifer. One of the follow-up questions we've learned to ask in complaining rituals is, given these realities, what do you think is possible? And just something so benignly powerful about just asking that. In all curiosity, given these realities you've just complained about, what do you think is possible? And sometimes people will see it coming, they'll say, hell no, I am not answering that question. I want to stay where I'm at. But if people will play with it a little bit, it opens up space. And Bill, I love what you're describing, living in and serving in a dense metropolitan community. Are you still there with that? Do you want to name it out loud?
Yeah, no, thanks, Tom. So I think the reality is that even in a dense metropolitan areas, everything's made up of these small tribes or neighborhoods or networks, and which have the same reality of influx or outflux. So your kids get too old, so you move out, or you piss somebody off at the last potluck or whatever else, and so you're kind of out. But the notion of belonging and bonding is so essential, and we lose that. We think we can create mechanics for programs, but that's not the same thing about belonging and bonding that comes through relationship building that the church is actually rooted in. Just think of what Paul says about being of one loaf, right? In 1 Corinthians. Sorry to get a little theological there, but yeah. So I think it's one thing is like what you're studied in certain communities. It's a part of the reality of even in a large community that's so dense. It's like we're made up of a bunch of the small communities and networks, and all those dynamics still work in the same way. And same
lovely.
Possibility.
I'm so glad you shared that. I meant to mention that, and thank you for sharing that, Bill. That's awesome. That's great. Right on.
Steve, you want to talk us through what you're naming there with the What's Good Project ritual practice?
Sure. So, it's very hard to just simply just make something negative go away. You really almost have to build something that is bigger than the negativity, that creates a new practice so that the negativity can't breathe. And so if we think about a project as a practice, something that we're gonna pay attention to and keep at, not just a particular thing that just comes and goes, or maybe we think of what's good projects, but we think creatively about it. How does that supplant the negativity and help shift the culture?
Jennifer?
I mean, yeah, for sure. I think anything that you can do, we all can do to give form to something helps it stick more. I mean, that's exactly the reason what I do in my art practice is I go into communities and I ask people what's good where they live, and those conversations inspire the paintings that I do. And I needed that structure for myself to focus on that. And also I wanted to again, share the stories that I kept hearing, right, over and over about people who are in the face of real sadness and desolation and trauma and crisis, are like showing up courageously, right, and making changes. And so so yeah, I mean, I definitely am a project person. I need that, and I think that I would, if that's something that feels like it would work for different spaces, I would say absolutely.
Wow. Oh, I recommend Meg's note in the background here to you. As a follow-up on this, I want to name that in January and February on Second Tuesdays, we've invited Jackie Kelm, who wrote a book, Appreciative Living, who talks about these very particular practices of turning the tide in culture through daily practices, starting with our own souls. So can't recommend her highly enough. When I first found her book 10 years ago, it was a life-changing experience for me. In fact, I asked 2 or 3 people to hold me as accountability partners because I realized I was being asked to repent from my diagnostic urges and to start celebrating what worked. Because I'd grown up, I was so good at figuring out what's wrong, what's broken, whose fault is it. I got to come up with a scientific reason for why things are going so badly here. And then I realized that's not really my calling. My calling really is to help people recognize what does work, the assets they already do have, and help them see just how powerful they are. So we are super grateful that you would come on and share your work. And Jennifer, one more question before we go, and then we're going to turn off the recording and invite people to speak in a non-public setting. How has doing this work changed you personally?
Oh, that's an awesome question. Thank you. It's made me more joyful, honestly. It really has. I mean, that sounds kind of cliche, but I'm a happier person, honestly. It feels when I was a younger artist, I always felt like art was more self-indulgent. I didn't have a good role model of how art can be in the world in a way that felt good to me. And doing this kind of work feels like has a purpose that's bigger than my little own ego and painting career. And I love hearing people's stories. I think that's the Mississippian in me, that Southerner storytelling and sharing and using art as a way to kind of do that has been really great. Yeah, it feels good. Thanks for asking that.
You're welcome. And it's evident that it feels good. That's lovely. Meg, anything else you want to say since you brought us together today? Thank you for that beautiful introduction to Jennifer.
No, just gratitude, all gratitude for the work that they're doing and the care that they're taking. And even when they show up, even in presentation, they are living out the things that the principles that she outlined for you all. I can testify to that. So I'm just gratitude.
Yeah, that's
and I hope
lovely.
you all found things you needed to hear too.
Oh gosh, yes. And Steve Godfrey, we are putting you on assignment in response to your observation regarding Mennonite and Mormon communities. We want to hear what you're learning from Mennonites and Mormons about belonging and bridging, and we hope you'll bring that back to us, maybe in our appreciative living conversations, because that sounds like, wow, what Mennonites and Mormons would ever expect that an Episcopal priest would come to them with such a wide open heart, as you've modeled here with the question, to say, what should we be learning from you about belonging and bridging? But we want to, you can do it, Steve. We're right behind you. We'd love to hear what you learn as you ask. It's beautiful. Anyone else? We have maybe 1 minute, 2 minutes. Any last questions besides what you put in the